Hello, everyone, and it's Gabriel Logue again with Irish Side of the Moon. I've got Mr. David Blume here. David is the Executive Director of International Institute for Ecological Agriculture and the author of the book Alcohol Can Be a Gas. David, good to have you on the show. How are you doing this fine day?
Oh, we're doing great here in California.
Okay. Nice. Sunshine. David,
yes, we have that today.
As you have probably lots of days, right?
Well, it all depends. We live on the coast here, so we see it's not as sunny as everybody thinks California is, but it's very mild,
Okay.
And so that's why it's nice here.
Okay, David, you could be described as a leading campaigner in putting forth the idea for ethanol as a viable alternative to gasoline, or as we call it here, petrol, for vehicles. What is it all about?
Well, basically, alcohol, or you also hear it called ethanol in the press, is it's the original automobile fuel before gasoline was ever invented, and it was always the best fuel. It was probably the most common fuel used by cars up until about 1900, and then the oil interests began to compete, quite strongly for the market. And at that time, basically, what oil companies did was make heating and lighting fuel, essentially kerosene, and for oil lamps and for heaters, and the stuff that was volatile, the stuff that easily exploded. Nobody wanted that, and so they used to flush that into rivers at night to get rid of it. But Rockefeller figured out that he could run cars on that volatile stuff, and it was better to sell it for a few pennies than it was to throw it away. So that's how gasoline was born, as the toxic waste product of the heating and lighting industry, and it went in to compete with alcohol as a fuel around the world. And initially, most of the vehicles that were out there had to be converted to run on gasoline, or they were designed to be dual fuel.
Okay. Like
the famous Model T from Henry Ford was able to run on both alcohol and gasoline.
Right, and when I was watching some of your presentations, you presented the whole prohibition and where that came from. Could you tell the listeners that? I found that most fascinating.
Well, yes. In the early 1900s, the market was about 50% alcohol, 50% gasoline in the United States, and pretty similar around the world. Typically, you found gasoline for sale in cities where there were a lot of people and it made sense to have stations. But around the world, if you went out into the countryside or if you were living in the countryside, alcohol was made on farms. And so people, when they drove out to the country, would stop by a farm and buy alcohol to get back to the city, and they would switch between one fuel to the next. Well, Rockefeller decided that he'd had enough of free market competition, and so around the world he had tried to push the idea of banning alcohol because of its use as a beverage. And in the United States, the United States was the only place he was successful in doing this, even though he did try it in most of Europe. And what he did is he funded a religious group in the United States called the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, and they took the $4 million that Rockefeller gave them and went and basically bought the votes in Congress to have a prohibition of alcohol enacted. And in the United States, this was remarkable because the bill that was passed was not a simple piece of legislation, but an amendment to our Constitution, which took a 2/3 majority to vote for. So it took quite a long time for us to get that reversed in the United States and be able to use alcohol industrially again, because basically it banned alcohol for all uses, not just drinking. So we couldn't use it in our vehicles either. And that was the whole point of Rockefeller's efforts. But places like, France and England and Ireland basically laughed off this provincial thinking about alcohol as a beverage, and, he was not successful in crushing alcohol in that way around the world.
I would like to see him try it in Ireland. Oh, boy. We have been running on alcohol for a long time, but not our cars.
Well, making alcohol is mankind's second oldest profession. So I think every nation has been fond of alcohol for a long time. And, for quite a while, it was the only choice in most places. Like if you were in New Zealand, nobody was delivering oil or gasoline there. It was too far away, and there weren't tankers until after World War II of any, volume or size. And places like the Philippines didn't, get deliveries of gasoline or oil either. So they made their alcohol out of nipa palms, which they tapped very much like maple sugar trees, where they got the sap from the nipa palm and made alcohol from it to run the country. And in New Zealand, they used sugar beets primarily to run the country, as did Germany. Germany had over 70,000 alcohol fuel cooperatives prior to the end of World War II. So in Germany, they use mostly potatoes. I understand you grow just a few potatoes there in Ireland. So,
Yes.
And as you probably know, a good portion of the crop are either green potatoes or sprouters or too small for market. And so in Germany, they took all that surplus potatoes and made basically 190 proof vodka, which they ran the entire country on, and even into World War II. So they had an independent source of fuel through the war, and Allied attempts to knock out their oil refineries had no effect on the German war machine because most of their vehicles ran on alcohol. So it took bombing all those tens of thousands of alcohol distilleries around the countryside to dry up the German fuel supply.
Okay, so we used to use alcohol as a fuel. Then Rockefeller and other interests consolidated the petrochemical industrial base and took over. So what you're proposing is now that we go back to a cleaner source of fuel. So what crops can be grown to produce the basic product for the fuel, first of all?
Well, gosh, there's all kinds of things we can produce alcohol from. And the idea, as I'm sure folks are familiar, is it's one of fermentation. So we want to use pretty much anything that has sugar or starch in it, or something that can be broken down into individual sugars. And then we add yeast, which basically make a beer, which then is distilled to make essentially a whiskey. So it's a simple process, as we all know, but the devil's in the details. And, I would say that one of the best sources in Ireland would be something you wouldn't even think of, which would be kelp. You've probably heard of the marine plant kelp that they harvest in great quantities in Norway and other parts of Europe. But since you have such a coastline, kelp growing would probably supply the whole country with alcohol, because kelp is actually made up of long chains of corn sugar, fructose. So, off of most of Europe, there's a elevated level of nutrients because of all the, people living in Europe and the sewage going into the ocean. Even if it's treated, that's a lot of nutrients. And kelp could be produced there to the tune of 120,000 liters LC per acre. So I'm mixing units here.
Okay.
But basically, it's a very large quantity compared to corn. And let's see if I can convert this. It's around it would be 250 gallons per acre. So, you're looking at a much smaller quantity, at 1/10 to 1/20th the amount that we could produce from kelp. We could also use crops that grow on land. The marshy crop cattails, and I don't know what the common name is in Ireland. It's the plant that looks like a stick with a sausage on it. That when you go by marshes, you'll see them sitting there. Those plants produce an enormous amount of starch from, just very similar to cornstarch from the roots of that plant. And using that plant to treat sewage, whereas before it goes into the ocean, would absorb a lot of the nutrients. And we get extremely high yields there as well, about 15 times as much as corn. So, those are some unusual crops. But, of course, waste potatoes themselves are a good source. In Ireland, we can grow a lot of other things like sugar beets, which can produce 4 or 5 times the amount of potatoes or corn.